Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football Dill, year two under Matt Rhule. I don't think the jump was taken that Matt Rhule expected, that I think a lot of Nebraska fans expected in 2024. Let's open up the conversation of how do we get Nebraska there going into 2025, year three under Matt Rhule. And I think the beauty of this era of college football is you can do a lot of things in one offseason to really get things right. And I think you'll see a couple of different things that Nebraska will address. One, there are certain positions on this football team that we're going to talk about potential targets in the transfer portal. But I also want to get into the offensive coordinator spot where, to Matt Rhule's credit, I think he did a phenomenal job when he got to Nebraska. I think he hired at large a dynamite staff. I mean, he crushed the Tony White hire. I think a bunch of the coaches on the defensive staff are really, really good. But you look at the offensive coordinator spot, and we all had our question marks about Coach Satterfield coming to Nebraska. I mean, he spent time with an NFL quarterback at South Carolina with Spencer Rattler, wasn't really able to produce that good of an offense. I think we kind of took that blind faith from Matt Rhule, having worked with Coach Satterfield, having known Coach Satterfield. And I think it's pretty apparent after year two that maybe you got to make a change there. So let's start with the offensive coordinator position, talk about a few candidates that we think would make sense for Nebraska, and then kind of just take a look at this Nebraska roster and identify some positions that we think Nebraska is going to be going after in the transfer portal. Now, before we get into it, as always, the Nebraska fans, I think most importantly, let it fly in the comment section. We're going to get into offensive coordinators. We're going to get into potential position groups that we think Nebraska targets in the transfer portal. Would love to hear from you guys in the comment section. Dill, go back 12 months when we were talking about Dylan Rhule flipping his commitment to Nebraska, talking about Jamal Banks as they were coming in. I think it's going to be a really fun next couple of weeks and months for this Nebraska program. A lot of the things that you guys put in the comment section is probably going to be what we're talking about with this program over the next couple of weeks. Appreciate you guys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Dill, let's get into it. Let's get into the offensive coordinator conversation first. I think this is probably the hottest topic within the Nebraska fan base. You open up the message boards, it's hot. And it is hot about Coach Satterfield. And, I think rightfully so. I think there's a lot of things to be frustrated with. I'm going to throw off three names. And I'm going to throw off first Dana Holgorsen, who just is joining this Nebraska staff. Dill, with the quarterbacks that Dana Holgorsen has worked with over the years of his coaching career, specifically as an offensive coordinator and quarterbacks coach, this would be certainly, if you just kind of elevated him going into 2025, I think that'd make a lot of Nebraska fans fired up to see what this offense would look like in the 2025 year.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be really interested to see what Holgerson can do as a coordinator again, because I think there were some moments where, as a head coach, it didn't always feel like he ran the tightest ship or built the
Yes.
greatest culture in the history of the world. So, again, not a super successful run through the head coaching game. Had a good run at South or West
Yeah,
Virginia.
well, see, I wouldn't say bad. I think he gets kind of unfair criticism. You don't see a lot of head coaches hold jobs for 5+ years. He did that at two different stops. But I think you're kind of right. As a head man, he ain't the leader of men that Matt Rhule is. That being said, in terms of a play caller, but I think more importantly, a quarterback developer, that's where he excels. I mean, you go back to his time at Texas Tech, working with Graham Harrell, and as a wide receivers coach, working with Mike Crabtree, then going to Oklahoma State, working with Brandon Weeden, then going to Houston, working with Case Keenum, who is one of the most productive and prolific quarterbacks that we've seen in college football. It's a long track record of him working really well with quarterbacks. And I think if you're Matt Rhule, you want to make sure you're bringing in a coach that's going to squeeze every ounce of potential out of Dylan Rhule. And I think, look, Dana Holgorsen has that track record that he can do that with Dylan.
And they have to ignite the passing game again. Matt Rhule kind of said it. I mean, what did he say? He's looking every corner, if you will. And there has been that issue, frankly, for Rhule is he's only brought guys he's worked with in the past. It does feel like it's been a little bit insular in terms of hiring. And you said it at the top, like Satterfield was his guy. I mean, obviously Dana Holgorsen comes from a totally different line of football, if you will, kind of more that Mike Leach style. So again, I don't know that Nebraska is going to go to that total air raid, spread them out kind of offense, but I do think they need to get some element of those concepts and that ability to create some space on a football field and be a little bit more dynamic into this offense, because you're seeing it right now. It almost feels like they're trying. but something's not obviously clicking
Yeah,
at all.
I think you can bring in Dana and have him run his offense, but not just go right to the air raid principles. Like you can still play Nebraska football, but just kind of implementing, a little bit more space, a little bit more of a vertical passing attack. I think that one would make a lot of sense. Still, here's another one. Try this one on. Andy Ludwig just resigned as Utah's offensive coordinator. And why I'm putting out Andy Ludwig, and I get he did not a good year for Utah's offense that had a lot to do with Cam Rising getting hurt and relying on a true freshman quarterback to come in who's clearly not ready. Dill, when I look at Utah in the success that they've had with Andy Ludwig as your offensive coordinator, I think Utah wins games exactly how Nebraska wants to win. And you might win if you bring in Andy Ludwig. Are you going to have a top 10 scoring offense in the country? No, probably not. But you're probably going to run the football pretty dang well. You're going to control the time possession. That's kind of how I envision Matt Rhule reaching his peak with Nebraska. And I think Andy Ludwig could be a guy that, kind of brings that kind of Nebraska offense to life a little bit.
And I get that. I mean, I get the idea of Andy Ludwig because, again, it is leaning into what Nebraska wants to be. But I think, again, you didn't recruit Dylan Raiola to go in and be what the Utah quarterbacks were. And you're just like asking my perspective. I get why you
Yeah.
might want him and
Yeah.
why he might work and why it might be successful and why it's a better fit, arguably. But I want a guy who's going to get every drop of the Raiola. That's kind of my goal for this offensive coordinator spot. So, again, as much as maybe he can do that, and again, he never really had great
I was going to
players
say,
like that, but I haven't seen him develop quarterbacks the way a guy like Dan Holgerson or some of these other guys have.
I do feel like he squeezed. I mean, you look at Cam Rising. It's like
He
not
did
like
have
Cam
Cam
Rising.
Rising going. That's fair.
And Cam Rising's nowhere nearly as talented in the arm
But it was
as
a
Dylan
little
is.
bit of a different way. It felt like how they got him going is a lot more predicated on his legs and rolling out and getting
Yeah.
outside the pocket. I mean, it wasn't like just cutting teams up through the pocket, kind of the way I think Dylan Raiola really should be doing it at Nebraska.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I do think if you're Matt Rhule looking to make an offensive coordinator hire, it really does need to be quarterback centered. Like, what guy can we bring in that's going to squeeze every drop out of Dylan over the next couple of years? I do, and I'm not saying you hire an offensive coordinator just for Dylan, but it's got to be predicated on getting the best out of the quarterback. Because I mean, in any offense, if you have a good quarterback, you're probably going to be pretty good offense. Dill, here's the last one. You talk about hiring a coach for quarterback. Tino Sinceri at Indiana. Look, if I'm a program like Nebraska, I am looking at Indiana's coaching staff and trying to not take everybody there, but what they're doing is clearly working. And the thing is, what they're doing has worked at every single stop that Curt Cignetti's been on. Curt Cignetti and Matt Rhule have a very similar kind of like rise in their head coaching career, where they kind of started off at some lower level football, but kept that same coaching staff. You look at Matt Rhule as kind of just like coach with the same guys at every single stop. Tino Sinceri, 35-year-old, has worked with him at James Madison, then went over to Indiana. One, specializes in developing quarterbacks. That's where he kind of cut his teeth as a quarterbacks coach. I don't think he calls the plays. So he's a young offensive coordinator that might not have play calling duties, but man, he's been around some of the best offensive minds in all of college football. It's kind of a little bit of a gamble, but that's like a high risk, high reward hire where you might hit, and you might hit in a big way with one of the more up and coming offensive coordinators that we see in all the country.
Yeah, no, I would totally be on board with that. Again, that is like and whether you do it as like a co-offensive coordinator or one guy has a little bit more experience, I do think you want some of the Indiana magic. I think a lot of schools are seeing that. I think that staff, frankly, is going to get rated pretty hard because you kind of said it. I mean, we talked about getting every drop out of Dylan Raiola. They're getting every drop out of everybody on that offense. And it's been really, really impressive. So I think you look like, yeah, there's going to be a lot of coaches moving from Indiana. I think if you're Nebraska, I mean, you can give Tino Sinceri his shot, let's say, to really make it big in the coaching world. And it's a little bit high risk, high reward. But again, like, I think you can kind of believe in that. And it's like the Satterfield safe hire. That was boring. It didn't really work. Like, I'm okay with taking your shot a little bit.
Matt Rhule said he said this a couple times in a couple different press conferences, and this is something I love about Matt Rhule is he's always very candid. Like, he's going to tell you what he's thinking. He's basically out here saying, like, everything just looks hard for us on the offensive side of the football. Know what offense everything seems easy every single play, it's Indiana. I mean, like it's look, Curtis Rourke, and this is not, hopefully no Indiana fans are listening at minute 10 here. The Curtis Rourke ain't Dylan. He's a solid MAC quarterback that made the jump to Indiana, and he's carving Big Ten defenses up. Pretty legitimately good Big Ten defenses. Dill, everything looks so easy in that Indiana offense. If you want that kind of offense, go get a guy like Tino. I'm really high on Tino. I think that would fire up a lot of Nebraska fans. All right, we'll see where they go with the offensive coordinator spot.
One last one I'll throw out. What about Mike Locksley if he ends up getting fired at Maryland? Because I think there's a very, very good chance he doesn't make it. Frankly, I'm not sure he wants to be the head coach at Maryland anymore. I couldn't imagine kind of like make a Chip Kelly type move where you go to a team where you can just go coach football again. You don't need to be responsible for everything. And frankly, it's not really working at Maryland. You've kind of seen them hit their peak, and now they're on the downslope, it feels like. So I almost look like that type of coach, and there might be some others out there, but I would really not mind seeing Mike Locksley calling plays.
That's kind of scummy, though, because that's kind of my guy for my Michigan Wolverines. So we're trying to keep that on the down low. I want Coach Locke at Michigan. That would be a fire hire. I think that'd be a phenomenal hire where, one, he's a very, very good offensive coach. Number two, he recruits his tail off. And so that's kind of like the double whammy. And again, I don't think Nebraska, when you're hiring an offensive coordinator, I don't think it should be recruiting centered. Like, you hire position coaches to get it done on the recruiting trail. You hire an offensive coordinator to dial it up, script up games, scheme up an offense, and score points. I think Coach Locksley kind of gives you the best of both worlds there. I think that'd be a phenomenal hire. Dill, let's go quickly. We spent a little bit longer than I thought on the offensive coordinator spot. Looking at this Nebraska offense, where's the position group that you would expect Nebraska to be most aggressive with in the transfer portal?
I honestly think it's going to end up being defensive line. I think you probably
offense
argue
first. We're sticking with the holy smokes. You're good. I got a whole script out here, and you're going off script.
You left that pretty general, but if you want to stick on, I was going to say it's either D line or wide receiver. So there you go. It's probably going to end up being wide receiver. You're going to have to replace the two guys who it feels like are eating up the bulk of the targets, and you like some of the young guys coming up through that system. Ja'Cory Barney's had a really good year. Jalen Lloyd, but you still probably aren't going to have that boundary guy if you don't find him in the transfer portal, unless Malachi Coleman makes like a unicorn jump, because right now you obviously just haven't seen it from him yet.
I wouldn't be surprised if you see him at the transfer portal. And I it's hard to know what's going on there without being in the program. And we knew Malachi Coleman. I was just talking with a Nebraska fan a couple weeks ago about Malachi. Like, we knew it'd be a slower burn. You know what I mean? Like, he was just a really traitsy, high-caliber athlete that hadn't played much wide receiver, and there's a little bit of a growing pain there. But if you haven't really figured it out by the end of year two, that's probably a little bit of a concern. I'm kind of with you, and I think it really is the type of wide receiver as well, because you look at Ja'Cory Barney. One, you're doing everything you can to keep him out of the transfer portal because that kid is going to be special wherever he is. Big body boundary wide receiver. Exactly. I think you crushed it with guys like Jamal Banks and Isaiah Nayor. That's what you're trying to replicate. One thing I'd kind of throw out there is maybe not a redshirt senior. Maybe get some wide receivers that have some eligibility remaining. So it's like, all right, you take a jump in 2025 with Dylan. He can kind of return all his weapons going into 2026 and really have a special season. Maybe that's something you're looking at, but a big-bodied wide receiver, that X wide receiver, that's probably what you're looking at. I think on the offensive line, you got a good young pipeline. I really don't think you need to go to the offensive line in the transfer portal. The other position I would throw out there is running back. Yeah. Look, and the Nebraska fans know this. I think the running back position, look, they're running the football. One of the worst teams in the Big Ten in terms of yards per carry, maybe the worst, quite frankly, outside of Purdue. I don't think it's on the offensive line. Normally, when you talk about rushing attacks, they can't get it going. It starts with the offensive line. I think it's these running backs just leaving a lot of carries and a lot of yards on the football field. I'm okay with Dante Dowdle and Emmett Johnson. They're probably coming back next year, and that's not a bad, stable of depth running backs, but I don't think there's an elite caliber starter. Now, you got a really, really talented freshman coming in next year. Maybe he can be the guy. Gabe Irvin probably hits the portal. Ramir Johnson's out of eligibility. You want to give Dylan a good run game because he's so good off of play action. Go get a high caliber running back.
They need somebody to be able to make some plays for them. I think you kind of said it. It's like, again, like Dowdle and Emmett Johnson are like fine backup running backs, like depth pieces. Like they'll give you good carries, but they're not made like Matt Rhule even said it. Like, we're not turning 10-yard runs into 30 and 40-yard runs. And that is a running back problem fundamentally, because like again, they've had holes, they've had abilities, but they get tackled one-on-one with safeties way too consistently. I think you look like, again, can you go get like a Rocket Sanders type running back? Like, you see what he can do for a team in that Texas A&M game for South Carolina. And so you have that type running back, it kind of changes your offense a little bit. Right now, they just don't really have that.
Now, I think the problem is like how many elite running. That's not a hard
Running
position
back
to address.
is not a bad place to go, because even like you find a bunch of like lower mid-major guys who are really good running backs who you can get out of the portal.
Yeah, and that's one of those position groups where it's not that hard to make that jump. You see guys do it plenty. On the defensive side of the football, I got two positions that stand out. One, the interior defensive line. It was a position I was surprised Nebraska did not address in the transfer portal coming in. And it's not because you need starters. Like, you had two bona fide dogs in Nash and Ty. The depth is such a problem. I mean, one, Ty and Nash are playing an incredibly high amount of snaps, which is not really what you want when you're trying to maximize your defensive line. Number two, the drop off when Ty and Nash aren't on the football field, it's huge. And so if you're Nebraska, you're losing your two starters, the two guys that really are the only two on the roster right now that have showed their Big Ten caliber. That needs to be, and it's a tough position to address, but I think you got to get that right in the offseason. Now, there are some guys that you maybe feel good about, like Vincent Jackson has showed some things, Riley Van Papa going into year 3, Keona Davis, but none of them have really shown you they've taken that step yet. That has to be outside of the boundary wide receiver, and maybe even in front of the boundary wide receiver. The inside of the defensive line needs to be addressed in the portal.
Yeah, and that's one that's almost like obvious, because you kind of knew when you were going to lose those two, unless like some guys like Lefotu like make some big jumps, obviously.
And they might.
Like, we haven't seen it yet, and that is going to be the issue. And I don't think if you're Nebraska, and especially Matt Rhule heading into year 3, like, that's a big one. They need to win some games next year, because you kind of thought they had a good chance. It started off really good this year, and you saw kind of a trail. And I don't know if that's a depth issue or if they just obviously got into the more of the meat of their schedule. But they need to win some games. Otherwise, I think like the momentum Matt Rhule's been building up, you start to lose a little bit. So I don't think you can go in without at least two starting defensive tackles that you feel really good about.
I really do agree with that. And it's not like a glorified position, but it's something that when you watch Nebraska football games and Ty and Nash aren't on the football field, it gets bad. And you got to make sure you fix that. Off-ball backer would probably be the last one. You're going to lose a guy like John Bullock, Javin Wright. I think you got a dog in Vincent Shavers. I think he's going to be very, very good. But still, I guess what I'll ask you is, wouldn't you want probably a pretty experienced off-ball linebacker coming in to kind of balance out some of the youth that you're going to be rocking with in 2025?
Yeah, but I don't mind. Even you go back to the spring game, I thought the young guys played pretty good football. I really do like Mekhi Bayer. I think he's going to have – I mean, I actually don't hate where the linebacker position's at, because I do like the young talent in that.
Well, but like outside of Mekhi and Vincent Shavers, like, that's thin. I just like there's not a ton of proven commodities. And again, I
just think Shavers is going to kind of be that guy. So if you have the two of them, I think you're in decent shape. Like, again, like
I get that. I think that's fair. You got to build depth, and the transfer portal is a way to build depth within your roster. And I don't know if I like, as good as Vincent Shavers is, and I think he's going to be a stud going into year 2. I still think I want guys that have played more college football at that off-ball backer position. You've had so much experience in there for the last couple of years. It's going to be young. It's going to be green, and maybe you have confidence in Vincent Shavers, but you want to have a better than just two backers that you really trust going into a year. In the secondary, I think.
But even a guy like Dylan Rogers, I feel like you're underrating some of these younger guys. Like, I don't know that we totally know exactly what they're going to be as much as you. I think we've seen, frankly, like guys like Elijah Judy play. Like, I know he's not going to be a particularly great Big Ten kind of caliber at the defensive tackle spot. I think there are some young guys coming up in this pipeline that, again, are better than you're giving it credit for. And frankly, I want to see Matt Rhule not rely on the portal as heavily. I think you want to see that trail off. I think you want to see some proof that these young guys, your second, third year guys, can be ready to play pretty quickly. So
Yeah,
I
I mean,
wouldn't.
and it's hard for us to sit here and talk about it because like we got to see practice, because you're not going to know if these guys are ready until the bullets start flying for us. Like Matt Rhule and that defensive coaching staff probably have a good idea of like who's going to be ready in 2025. We kind of don't outside of Mekhi and Vincent Shavers. Defensive backs probably a very similar story. Like you're losing some really good players in my opinion, especially a guy like Deshaun Singleton. But I think you're pretty good. And I think you kind of trust some of the young talent that you've recruited. I'm a big Jeremiah Charles fan. Sear Wright has played awesome football. Depends on kind of who stays. Marcus Buford, Malcolm Hartzog. I would guess they're going to be back next year. The secondary is probably one of those where it's like we'll see how we look.
And I
And
presume they'll get some depth pieces, but I don't think it's a position like the defensive line where you need to
yeah,
kind of go in and get the best guy available.
and what I'll close on is you want to use and this kind of backs up what you were saying, even with the backers. You want to use the transfer portal, prioritizing the positions in need. I've seen we see a lot of these programs just go out to get bodies, and they're not really prioritizing certain positions that you need. I think USC was the biggest example of that, where it's like they had a glaring hole, and they were just getting guys at every position but the glaring hole. Like use the transfer portal to fill in the cracks of your roster, wide receiver, interior defensive line. If you can address those two positions, I do think the talent's going to be very good and the roster is going to be complete in 2025. Went a little longer than the boys thought. Would love to hear from you guys in the comment section. Again, at least for me, like this is some of my favorite conversations to have, like the roster building stuff. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. A lot to talk about over the next couple of weeks. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. We'll talk to y'all later.